here's a basic mixing course outline. And in the 8 classes, so there are 8 2-hour live classes, and primarily I will be sketching out all of the steps and things that we talk about, and in the process actually working on a song. So those of you who participated in the master mixing course that finished up a little bit ago, then a month ago, I guess, and it really this is kind of doing a very similar thing to what I did there. So, but the difference here is that you will have access to the same multi-track that I'm mixing. So that is a big part of this. And I want to make sure that you have that, because I want you not just to see what I'm doing, but I want you to be able to call it up on your own application and do the same thing on your end. So what we'll have is 8 2-hour live classes, and then each class will have a series of 5 lessons. So this is part of what I was showing you here. So as we go through the individual courses and we do week 1 preparing to mix, then you will have individual links here to these 5 things, and these will be the lessons for class 1. This will be the live recorded class, and these will be lessons for class 2. So each one will be on a separate web page, and you can open them up. And you can follow the process step by step from top to bottom, right? So if you just really kind of go right along here from top to bottom, you'll go all the way through the course. The downloadable multi-track is linked here, okay? And there are a series of videos of me working on that. I'm not sure how much of that I'll keep. If I get another multi-track, then it will be a different link for that particular multi-track. And then you'll kind of see me mixing through the process and going through it step by step through each stage. And then you can kind of take your own direction with it and kind of follow along if you like. So the first step in the first class is preparing to mix. And we're going to go through each of these one by one, and I'll kind of give you like a basic outline of what each one is about, how it works, and how I'm going to teach it, and then you'll have a good idea of what's going on. So in the first, we'll talk about preparing to mix, and these are all about the mixing basics, right? Speakers, working with headphones, how to set up the speakers, where to set them up in your room, how to tune them, how to tune yourself to the speakers. Some of the basic principles of music, the 3D sound field, explaining that and some of the things that are going on there. Then we'll get into starting the mix. So this is about taking in all of the audio tracks, organizing them, color coding them, setting up the mix signal flow. We'll get into all of that stuff. And then starting the mix by doing your levels and panning work, right? And also, when we get to this, doing an assessment of what you have. So in other words, when you call up a series of audio files and you drag them in and you're listening to them for the first time, you have to figure out what's working with what. Are there edits? Are there pitch corrections that need to be made? What things need to be done? Do some basic editing work, clean up noises and clicks and pops and things that you might hear in the track. So there's some things that go along with that. Then we get into the equalization stage. And in the equalization stage, it's mostly subtractive EQ. So we start by working with and kind of taking out the garbage, right? Taking away the things that don't really belong. And then we'll work with some additive EQ in more of a tonal shaping kind of way. Right, so we'll kind of talk about that and when to use vintage equalization, right? So there are places where working with vintage equalization is a much better thing, right, than working with the sort of stock. There are times when you want to work with a more or less transparent EQ for filtering and things like that. And then there are times where you want to work with vintage EQs to help to add color and depth and density, and we'll get into that stage of the process. And then we'll get into dynamics. Now, this is a tricky one. In the master mixing course, I moved equalization. I have it kind of subtractive equalization and then dynamics and then additive EQ after that, actually after the effects. And I changed more than just additive EQ, right, shaping the mix. And so we'll kind of get to that. So I put all the additive stuff, and for the most part, it's a general engineering principle that you EQ after compression. The reason being is more utility than anything else, because when you have a compressor, you set a threshold and you get it to sound a certain way. And if you're adding EQ before or taking EQ away before that compressor, then what ends up happening is that you're changing the way the compressor is working in addition to changing the equalization. So what happens is if you say put a shelving EQ and you're boosting everything, let's say above 1K, and you sort of crank it up by 6 dB, but it's feeding into a compressor, then what happens is the compressor is going to be compressing more, and so you're not really going to be hearing as much of the result of your additive EQ as you would expect going into the compression. So you need to kind of open them up together in some way. So I do the equalization first here, where you kind of set it and get the basic presence, openness, filter out the stuff that you don't need through the mix, and then kind of set you up for the dynamic stage. And the dynamic stage in class 4 is really getting into compression, limiting, expanding, multi-band compression. All of my videos actually this week in my Mixing with Mike blog are all about, and if you're watching this much later than that, you can go to the MPG Insider website, go to Mixing with Mike blog, and you could look at the videos there. I go into the different forms of dynamic processing, downward compression, downward expansion, upward compression, upward expansion, and I explain, you know, kind of what those are all about. And I'll get into that to some detail with shorter videos like that for the dynamics. But really, I want to get into a more practical approach. It's like when you want a sound to appear in a certain place in the speaker, how do you apply the compressor? When would you want to apply a vintage compressor as opposed to just a sort of technical, transparent kind of compression, right? How do you move things forward or back in the speakers? How do you make things pump and breathe? How do you make something really present and focused and upfront? And so from that perspective, what I'm really looking to do with this is to make it so that when you go and you say, I want to achieve this with the sound, you're opening up the compressor, and it's like you're saying, okay, if I do this attack time and this release time and these basic settings, I can achieve the results, that the sound that I'm looking for. So, and much of the other work that I've done in terms of videos, in terms of describing the compression and getting into explicit detail about how it works with the attack, decay, sustain, release cycle of a waveform and blah, 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 and all of that is great, but not necessary, right? You can sort of get that, you know. In other words, you don't have to know necessarily how a guitar is manufactured in order to be able to play a guitar. You don't have to know how the guitar string is manufactured in order to play a guitar. What you do have to know how to do is to take that string, put the right size string in the right place, tune it to the right note, and, you know, wind it on properly so that when you do play it, when you do work on it, it gives you the results that you're looking for. And so this course is much more of a dynamic musical process where you're really learning to play with mixing as opposed to just you know, kind of throwing stuff against the wall, right? And kind of hoping that the results come out right. Or, you know, bleeding through, you know, looking at waveforms and trying to figure out what the ADSR cycle is to determine what form of compression you want to use. You know, that's not really appropriate. And the whole idea is that this is fun, right? So this is more like a, you know, a Play-Doh course. You got a whole bunch of colors here and you kind of mix them together and you make little Mr. Bill shapes and all kinds of whatever it is that you want to make with it. And that's more of the approach with this. And that's the way I want to approach the dynamics processing and show you lots of fun, cool ways of working with dynamics, because it's such a powerful, powerful tool. And most of what you get is two voices, like you need to compress, you need to compress, you need to compress. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine, but it doesn't tell you how to do it or what to do. Or the other voice is like, oh, be afraid of compression. You know, compression ruins things. It destroys dynamic. And actually, that is probably the worst advice you could ever get from anybody. To me, if you don't understand something, you know, especially something like this, like a compressor, you know, just max out all the settings, turn your speakers down really low and just max out all the settings and just take everything and go like all crazy with all the settings and see what it sounds like. Get a feel for what it is, because nobody gets hurt when you do that, right? As long as you turn your speakers down, you're not going to blow up your speakers. You can basically kind of do all kinds of stuff. You know, it's different if you have a race car, because if you go out in a race car and you don't really know how to ride one and you just, you know, hit the pedal to the metal and you're going 200 miles an hour, you're probably going to kill yourself and maybe some other people along the way. Here, it's like you're just mixing. It's all in your DAW. If you don't like it, you delete the plugin, right? Open up a fresh setting, reset the parameters to the basic thing. Nobody dies. And that's the beautiful part about it. So, I really encourage people being extreme, with it, go crazy with it and kind of feel out the dynamic, feel out what works, how it kind of, what it can do, what it's made of. And then you can kind of pull back because then you have some perspective on what it's all about, right? And that helps you with your approach to everything. So very cool. The next is effects processing, reverbs, delays, modulations, and a category here which is distortion, harmonic distortion. And so I want to talk about that because that's such a big thing. A lot of reamping things that people do, and a lot of the other things where you use components that have tubes, summing amps, all of those types of things that allow you to kind of tweak and really mess with the sound, right? In some ways, oral exciters, things like that, so we'll get into some of that stuff with effects, and that will really help to open up the sound field, right? So if you've done all the other work right and you got all the focus and density in the right places that you want with the individual sounds, then the effects should really open up the mix, right? Things will just start to pop out of the speakers or have a lot of front back movement, right? And a lot of dynamic. And then this is the most important process, really. Once you've kind of gone through this basic step, these basic steps here through the first 4 or 5 weeks, then you get into shaping the mix. So now you've done all these things, but there are still imbalances. This is the part where a mix really comes to life. And if there's any part of it that could be like 3 or 4 weeks long, it's this part. Because, what you're revisiting is all the levels. You're revisiting your pan settings. You're revisiting how you applied equalization, what you're doing with the compression, and how you tweak the effects processing, right? Because as you open up things and the more clarity that you get with sounds, the more you're going to expose other things that are going on, right, in the actual mix. And so you want to be really, you really want to be aware of what's going on, right? In terms of, sorry, I kind of lost my thought here. It looked like the video dropped out here for a second, but you want to be kind of aware of the overall picture, right? So this is more of like a zooming out of what's going on and looking at the overall production and then deciding, well, what is really going on here, right? What am I looking at in terms of how I want this? What do I want to be the focus of attention for the mix? And why is it not that way? And what can I do differently? I want to move the drums farther back in the speaker. So let me speed up the attack time on my compressors to make that kind of a little more apparent. I want to bring these acoustic guitars out a little bit more up front. So maybe I apply some kind of cool spreading or chorusing effect that maybe pulls them out of the speakers a little bit more. And really shaping things tonally, right? The mix is a little too warm, a little too muddy still, a little too bright and brittle sounding. How can I warm it up, right? And this is a part of the process that's probably the most creative, that is the hardest probably to teach, because the only way that you can really learn it is by doing a lot of mix mapping work and really digging into listening to music productions, kind of pulling them apart and seeing what the basic ideas and principles are of them. In the master mixing course, I talk about using a guide mix, right? A template mix. And a template mix is something that you're sort of aspiring to in terms of the sound of the mix. So you pick a song that's very similar in nature. Maybe the artist that you're mixing that particular song is really modeled after or really influenced by certain artists or a couple of artists' music. Maybe there's a particular mix that's really the direction and the attitude that you're going for. And when you compare it, you want to be able to say, what is it about that mix that makes it so ballsy sounding or so whatever, right? So in your face. And then this is where you're shaping your mix to kind of try to take it up to that next level where it gets exciting. And that's where you leave it off. And once the mix starts to feel exciting, you get into the automation. And the automation is all about getting into the fader movement, deciding how you want to play with certain things. Do you want certain instruments to be panning or moving around in the speakers? These are things that kind of can happen throughout the mix, right? So there's different levels of automation. It's what I call pre-automation. Pre-automation is when you automate something so that the gain stages are leveled out, say, on a vocal, so when it feeds into the EQ and compressor, they work consistently and efficiently. That's kind of pre-automation. And then there are things that you come across through the process of recording and mixing where you say, I want this shaker to be panning left and right, and that's just part of the sound, so I'm just going to put that in while I'm getting the sound because I know I want to do that. It's very definitive, right? And then there are times when, as you're shaping the mix, you're looking at it and you say, okay, I need some more movement or some things going around, or I want that reverse cymbal to sweep across the speakers. And then you have all these ideas. You want to automate delays for certain words in the vocal, right? Certain lyrics. And you start digging into the automation, the levels, balancing out the instruments from section to section. And then creating a pathway for attention, right, of the individual instruments, right? So you want to always have one individual thing that you're focusing on, right, that goes through from beginning to end. And then from there, when we've worked with all the automation, then we get to finishing the mix. And this is the stage where I really visit what I call the 3-tier mix structure, and which is basically dividing up your processing into 3 basic levels: an individual track level, a mix stem level, and then the master mix bus level. And that's where everything finishes up and wraps up. And so this is about finishing the mix, putting that final polish on it, preparing it for mastering, right, and printing it, and how you manage that and how you set that up, how you deal with doing updates of mixes. So the artist loves the mix, but this guitar solo is too loud. So how do you do the update of the mix? That type of thing, right? How do you print versions, mix minus, a cappella versions, that, and all of this is just built very well into the 3-tier mix structure, which I'll get into. So, and that's wrapping up and printing the mix so that it's all prepared for mastering, right? And that would be the end process. So this is the the basic overview, right? And now let's dig into some of the individual classes here, and then I will kind of poke around and show you a few things just to kind of give you a bit of specific information about the individual classes.